Hello, everybody. Welcome. Get yourselves comfortable. If you're having lunch, have your lunch. If you're joining from the Asia region, dinner perhaps. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes whilst everybody logs on. We'll probably start the webinar at around 2 past. So just, yeah, get comfortable. I find this is always the most challenging part of any webinar, is waiting those first 2 minutes for the webinar to start. Surprisingly very long 2 minutes. I hope everyone is having a good day. Perhaps you can write in the chat where you're joining from. There is the chat functionality where you can just leave comments, and then there's also the Q&A functionality as well if you have specific questions. But feel free to say hello on the chat, say where you're joining us from while we wait for everybody to join. And excuse my, I've got some sun glaring in the background, so I'm kind of moving backwards and forwards so that I'm not sitting in the shadows. Hello, everyone. Brilliant. We've got some UK. I see a partner from Iran. I see a partner in India. Spain, getting quite an international group today, which is brilliant. I'm joining you all from Greece, normally based in London, but I have been hiding out in Greece for the last month, trying to grab some sunshine before returning back to grey and rainy London. Got Ireland. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I think we've just got about 1 minute and then we'll hop in. So really quite a diverse group. I won't be able, I saw Namrita, you've raised your hand. I won't be able to unmute participants, so if you have any comments, feel free to put them into the chat. Ooh, South Coast Liz, that sounds lovely. Hello, Maria from Argentina. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for joining. Brilliant. Well, I'm very excited to have you all participating today and to see almost, if not every continent joining us today, which is a great great sign. Sorry, while I unplug my telephone, which is number one doing. Right, so we will get started. A couple of logistics notes. So this webinar is being recorded. So if you have the utmost desire to review it after today, you will be able to access the recording, and you will also get a copy of all the slides. During the webinar, if you have any questions, please try and use the Q&A feature. So use the chat if you have any comments, if you want to talk amongst yourselves or sort of start a discussion, and then use the Q&A for specific questions, and there'll be some time at the end to be able to go through them and answer them. For those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Eleni Polokrignadou, and I'm the Commercial Director at Sintali. Sintali and SGS collaborate to act as an Edge Global Certification Partner for IFC, and today I will be taking you through why and how every building can be green. I'm just going to turn off my camera for the presentation because I think it can get a little bit distracting, and I'm a Greek, so my hands tend to move a lot while I present, so to save you from the distraction, I'll turn off the video and I'll come back on for the questions. Let me just do that now. Whilst my toolbar has vanished, excuse me. There we go. Right, so let's get started. So we're going to answer 3 fundamental questions today. It's quite a big subject, but it really comes down to 3 key questions. The first is, why do we need green buildings in the first place? Which brings us on to the second question around, what are the benefits of green buildings? And finally, the ultimate question, how can we green every building? So let's get started with the first question, which is, why do we need green buildings? We've heard about the climate crisis for many, many years, and now it's genuinely knocking on our doorstep and becoming a lot harder to ignore than it used to. If we are to reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at halving our global greenhouse gas emissions in the next 10 years and moving to net zero emissions by 2050, which once upon a time sounded quite far away, but is really literally around the corner. Now, this net zero by 2050 came about through the Paris Agreement. So the big global climate agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the impact. We've seen a lot of commitments, a lot of pledges from governments and corporates, perhaps most notably recently China's commitment to reach net zero by 2040, as well as the US agreeing to rejoin the Paris Agreement. Crossed fingers for today as the new president-elect takes his position in the White House. But despite all of those pledges and policies, we're still not there yet. If we are to meet the 1.5 degrees, we need to be even more ambitious in our actions, because as you can see from the graph in front of you, even with everything and a dash of optimism, we're still at around 2.1 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, which, as the IPCC report pointed out a couple of years ago, is actually significantly different than 1.5. Now, there are many high-emitting industries, and our usual culprits are energy and transportation. And one that's not often thought about is the built environment. But actually, buildings have quite a significant role to play in the global greenhouse emission problem. Today's buildings generate around 19% of greenhouse gas-related emissions and consume 40% of electricity globally. So we're really looking at a significant impact coming from residential and commercial buildings. And of course, we can't forget the emissions of all the construction materials that are used as well. So it's not just what the buildings are doing in operation, but also what's happening within the construction phase. If we look at the graph in front of you, the materials that are used in buildings are in green versus for other uses in gray. And you can really see how certain materials are primarily being driven by the building environment and construction of buildings. So for example, 75% of all concrete is used in buildings. Now, for those perhaps less familiar with the construction side of materials, you might be wondering why materials contribute so much to global warming. And it really comes down to the method of manufacturing. So the iron and steel sector, for example, account for 11% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And 5 to 7% of global CO2 emissions are caused by cement production. The numbers are really quite boggling when you think about sectors like transportation or agriculture, which are usually the ones that we focus on. So when you start to add all this material manufacturing on top of the constructions and new buildings, it's evident that the built environment really needs to rethink the way that we're doing buildings and the practices. And there's more. It's not just emissions. Buildings also consume scarce resources. So the IEA calculates that between 2015 and 2035, global energy consumption is expected to grow by 37%. So not only are buildings consuming a lot of energy now, but that demand is going to continue to grow over time, particularly as developing nations see high levels of urbanization and as we continue to see large increases in population. Simultaneously, water is getting scarcer. Global water consumption has grown at more than twice the rate of population in the last century, which means that by 2025, which is now 4 years away, which is quite frightening, 1.8 billion people will be living in countries or regions with absolute water scarcity, and 2/3 of the world's population could live under water stress conditions. And you don't need me to tell you just how important water is for life. So the way that we use water and energy in buildings is very, very important. Which brings us to this idea of what role buildings play within the broader climate, environment, and sustainability movement. Because clearly we can see there are quite a lot of hotspots. Buildings are consuming materials. They're consuming a lot of energy. They're consuming water. And of course, we can't forget the large amounts of monetary investment that go into buildings. And buildings have a long life cycle, from construction to usage, maintenance, renovation, and demolition. The building life cycle impacts the environment in multiple forms throughout its life cycle, from creating greenhouse gas emissions, affecting water, soil, noise pollution, waste, as well as the social and financial impacts of buildings. The conclusion? If we truly want to reduce the negative impact of buildings, we have to build green. Now, my guess is if you're sitting in this webinar, you probably aren't going to be the person who's going to argue with the idea that we need to build green buildings, or at least if you are, I'd love to have a wonderful discussion with you, and please feel free to have a chat in the chat box. But perhaps the question on everyone's mind is this idea that, well, does every building need to be green? And can every building be green? Because until now, the industry standard has been looking at buildings on an individual level. So one green office here, one green apartment block there, one luxury green shopping mall around the corner, but nothing really at scale. And here's the problem. We have a goal of reaching net zero emissions globally by 2050. We're now in 2021. I'm sorry, excuse this lovely phone in the background. So we're in 2021, and at the pace we're going at, we won't meet the target because it's simple maths. So if we take the average carbon footprint of a home built on site, and in this case, I'm looking at data from the UK, if we estimate that the carbon footprint is 65 tons of carbon for one home and as of 2017, we know that the world was at 36.15 billion tons of carbon. Dare I say more? Suddenly the net zero home or the beautiful green office building seems insignificant because it simply doesn't match the scale of the problem that we need to address. We all agree globally, we have to reach net zero emissions to tackle climate change. And the only way we're going to do that in the built environment is to stop thinking about flagship green buildings and instead start implementing green building principles on every single building, whether it's new, whether it's old, whether it's small, whether it's big, whether it's commercial, whether it's residential. Every single building has to be green for us to truly meet this broad and ambitious target. And meeting net zero isn't just about the environment and to pat ourselves on the back. It's about people. So mitigating the climate crisis has dramatic impacts for the global population, from extreme weather to changing agriculture conditions to rising sea levels. The climate crisis affects everyone, and particularly vulnerable populations. So mitigating climate change isn't just to save the environment, but it's to protect the people on this planet. Now, greening buildings also means building climate resilience. So as resources become more scarce, such as water, under these dramatic changes in the climate that we are seeing around the world, building efficient buildings that are self-sufficient, that are more resilient to these extreme conditions is really important, and again, affects all the people that are living or working inside these buildings. And finally, we green every building because green is not a luxury good. There are tangible benefits to greening buildings that need to be delivered for everyone to join. So now we know the why, and hopefully you're nodding your heads as you are sitting and listening. Let's dive a little bit more into the detail of green buildings and what benefits they bring, and why these benefits apply to the entire stakeholders within the construction industry. So if we take a step back and take a bird's eye view, there's a combination of factors that are driving the green building market forward. We've talked a little bit about Paris, so this agreement to meet global warming levels at 1.5 degrees. That's being implemented nationally and regionally, setting net zero targets and changing policies to really drive and encourage the building sector to be greener, either through stricter building codes or mandatory requirements, with ultimately the goal that zero carbon buildings will be mandatory in legislation to be able to meet this goal. There's also things like rising energy costs, particularly in developing countries, that are driving concerns and pushing towards green buildings because the cost of utilities is becoming a significant burden within the operation of a building. Simultaneously, there's a rise in the voluntary green building certification realm, with more and more developers and companies realizing the benefits of implementing green buildings and using standards such as EDGE, which we will talk about, to really prove credibility and prove that green buildings are adding benefits. And sometimes they're using that because there's subsidies for energy efficiency or for green building projects. And we're seeing more and more incentives from governments, from banks to really help drive the green building market forward, from tax credits to the ability to design and construct buildings with a larger floor area, to better loan rates from the investors. There's really quite a lot happening within the green building market, and every stakeholder is key in driving that forward, but particularly the government side as well as the investor side, as investors are putting pressure on companies to report on the environmental footprint of their investments, to prove how technologies are mitigating the climate crisis, and really driving this green finance or ESG forward. In terms of the benefits that come to those that are building green buildings, and particularly certified green buildings, there's quite an array. And the spoiler alert is that the benefits aren't only for the environment. So of course, we're seeing a complete mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions through the building of efficient buildings. But we're also seeing multiple savings for everybody, again, involved within the construction field. So it's estimated that a deployment of energy efficient technologies, all of which exist and are commercially available, could result in energy savings equivalent to the consumption of Russia and India combined. That's around $150 billion in savings just from deploying energy efficiency technologies that exist to date globally. There's so many benefits from reducing the operational costs of the building all the way through to what that certificate, what that proof of concept really does for the market. So there's loads of studies being done around the world, particularly in this case, the numbers you're seeing in front of you in the US and Europe, showing that from the developer side, developers are able to command higher sales prices for certified homes, with homes actually selling as much as 4 times faster when they have that certificate. Occupants, of course, are saving on utility bills, which becomes an important benefit, particularly for the residential sector. And as we look at the integration of affordability and sustainability and look at rolling out green buildings for social housing, that's a really, really important benefit that goes directly to the people most in need. And then, of course, on commercial properties, resale values, and then all the way through to banks. So banks are actually seeing lower default rates through green certified properties. So there's really benefits being achieved across the realm through multiple case studies. And it just goes to show that the green building sector has much value to bring, both on the environment, both on the people that appreciate and are in the buildings, as well as the people who are designing them. The key, though, is having a clear definition. So we haven't touched upon this yet, but the idea of a green building could mean 10 different things to 10 different people. And I'm just assuming in the same country as well. But if you add the definitions globally, you might suddenly have 10 buildings, all of which are considered green by someone and not green by someone else. And that's partly the benefit of having a certification scheme, because you can have a standardization and also have a third party to really verify your achievements, particularly in today's world with the rise of fake news, with greenwashing, with everybody claiming that they're green. It is important to have that piece of paper that says, yes, somebody else has checked this work and actually it is meeting certain green credentials. But it's also important to have a standard definition, because that allows the entire community, from the builders to the architects, all through to the buyers, to be talking the same language and to be understanding and really reaping the benefits of something that everybody understands. Now, there is no right or wrong answer with green buildings, but today we'll use the World Bank's definition of a green building, which is the one that is most commonly used in the investor community. And this definition is a green building is a building that uses less resources, typically 20% compared to a local benchmark, particularly in energy, water, and materials. Now, you'll find this kind of definition in investor documents, so the definitions for green bonds, for green loans, defining energy efficiency projects, typically because there needs to be a quantification of what the impact is, and it tends to be that 20%, although we are seeing movement towards higher percentages as climate legislation gets more ambitious. So using this definition brings us very nicely into Edge. Edge is what will help make every building on this planet green. And I'll start by showing you how today. So EDGE stands for Excellence in Design for Greater Efficiencies, and it was created by IFC, which is the private equity arm of the World Bank. EDGE is three things. It's a building design tool, so a free software that anyone can use and verify their projects in a matter of minutes. It's a green building standard, where to meet the standard, a building has to be 20% more energy efficient, water efficient, and use 20% less embodied energy and materials compared to a local base case, and a certification scheme. So first, let's look at what EDGE covers. So EDGE is very focused on resource efficiency. So that is the energy use, the water use, and then the embodied energy in materials. EDGE also calculates emissions, as well as the return on investment on the green elements. It does all of this through the EDGE app. So the EDGE app is a free software tool that allows anyone around the world to understand the efficiency profile of their building compared to a local baseline. It's simple, it's streamlined, it has a very friendly user interface, and what it really does is simplify the complexity of green buildings and allow any stakeholder in the real estate industry, from an architect to an engineer, all the way through to someone non-technical like a financier, to access data and make better decisions. So underneath this fairly simple interface lies a complicated energy modeling database and a comprehensive global database that is built on local building regulations, climatic data, utility cost data for every country on this planet. Now, needless to say, that's not a small piece of work, but because it was created by the World Bank, a lot of research and effort went into building out this database to essentially allow you and I, whether you're in Argentina or Ireland or London or Athens, to go in, select your location, state what kind of building you want to assess, and have this baseline, this base case, calculated and ready for you. Now, that's really revolutionary because before that, you would need to have specialized knowledge. You would potentially need to hire a consultant to do weeks of energy modeling to be able to calculate the base case. And frankly, everyone would be doing it slightly differently. And yet all of a sudden with the EDGE application, you have this in a standardized format, in a comparable format, and frankly, for free at your fingertips. So EDGE can be used for new and existing buildings and all typologies, and can be used around the world. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about this EDGE application, but this is really the first part, and I want you to hold on to this as to why it is possible to green every building on this planet. But let's move on, a little bit more information on EDGE, and we'll come back to the EDGE application. So to meet the EDGE standard, a user starts working on the EDGE application and gets their building to be 20% more efficient in energy, in water use, and in the embodied energy in materials. It's very clear, achievable targets. Everything is quantifiable. There's no qualitative measures within the application, but it's all looking at this percentage improvement. And that's really partly why this is a unique standard and something that everybody can understand, whether you're a green building expert, a technical person, or someone who simply is in a position of power and has to make a decision about whether to implement green buildings or not. Everybody can understand percentage improvements. They're non-negotiable, and they're a metric that really makes sense to everybody within the broader landscape. The certification process all happens within the application. So once a project is designed, if the project owner would like to go through certification, and you don't have to use the EDGE application, you can register the project through the application, upload documentation again through the application, and go through the EDGE certification process, which involves an audit process as well as a certifier reviewing the documentation. And there's many benefits to going through certification, and if you are interested, I'd be happy to discuss later on in questions, but just to give you a sense that this is a way that EDGE works. And there's 3 different levels for Edge. So the first bit we've talked about is this 20% improvement across the 3 categories, and that gets you Edge certified. But in 2019, Edge introduced 2 new certificates, Edge Advanced and Edge Zero Carbon. So for Edge Advanced, a project has to be 40% more energy efficient than the local baseline for energy, and then at least 20% on the other 2 categories. And to reach zero carbon, which today is on operational carbon, but we're hoping by the middle of the year, Edge will shift to actually having a full life cycle carbon, because the embodied energy and materials database will turn into an embodied carbon material database. But for now, it's operational. So to get the Edge Zero Carbon accreditation, a project has to be at least 40% more energy efficient on site, and then look to on-site, off-site renewable energy, procurement of green tariffs, and ultimately topping off with carbon offsets for the operational energy. So there are 3 levels, and for anybody going for zero carbon, the project first has to achieve the Edge Advanced for the asset before going to the zero carbon. Edge Certified, Edge Advanced are asset level certifications, whereas the zero carbon is a certificate that needs to be renewed, again, because it's based on the operational data. We've talked a little bit about Edge certification being available for new and existing buildings. The same standard applies to both. So if it is an existing building, the base case that's being calculated on the Edge application is actually the regulation as of the current date. So for example, if I live in a house that was built in 1960 and I want to do a renovation today, the base case that the renovation will be compared to is what the building regulations are for today, not what they were in 1960, which can make it challenging. But that's really the point, because we don't want to be having lots of buildings that are a little bit better than what they were in 1960, but really moving towards this bigger goal of greening the infrastructure around the world and really driving this agenda of net zero forward. Edge can be used for pretty much any building you could think of. These are the more traditional uses, so homes, hospitality, retail warehouses, hospitals, clinics, education. We've seen some other types of projects, from airports to shipping terminals to stadiums. So really anything that has heating, cooling, and some kind of occupant in it can be assessed for Edge, which really, again, pushes towards this idea of why every building can be green, not just a specific size or type of building or a specific value type of building. In terms of the broader Edge ecosystem, so you've heard IFC, the World Bank, they are the ones who created and own the standard. Centali and SGS are a global certification partner to IFC. So we work with the companies that want to go forward with a certification. Centali does the certification and SGS does the actual auditing. So they'll do on-site audits and the document reviews. And then we also work with Edge experts around the world. And Edge experts are consultants that are trained within the Edge application and within the Edge methodology that can help do more of the advisory work of how do you meet some of these standards. And together we offer a standard support package and a one-stop shop for clients going for that process. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if you are interested in any more details, just pop a question in the chat and we can come through it later. What I really want to show you is the Edge application, because you might be intrigued by Edge, but still wondering why Edge is this revolutionary tool and why it helps with this mission of greening every building. And sometimes it's easier to see it than hear it. So I'm going to stop sharing my presentation and shift into the Edge application and give you a quick look as to why this tool makes a lot of sense and how it can actually help to green buildings. So our first stop is the Edge Buildings website, which is where you would find the Edge application. So this is IFC's website. And in the top right-hand corner, you see this Edge app. If you click on it, you will end up on a page like this. Now, as I've mentioned, the Edge application is, sorry, I'm just realized, am I sharing the right screen? I think I'm sharing the right screen. So the Edge application, if you can't see my screen, please do chat and I'll just check. The Edge application is free. And you don't even need to create a user account to use it. I have created a user account because I have a saved assessment, which will make my explanation a little bit easier. But you can go in at any time. You can select your typology of building. So in this case, we're in homes, but you can pick over here. You can see your hospitality, your retail, your education, your hospitals, your schools, and you can start assessing your building within minutes. So for today's example, I'm using a low to middle income housing development in London. I've put here some basic details about the project. You'll see this is your design tab, and it just asks you where the project is located, what size it is, etc. And you can put some details in here. And you can start to build out what does it look like. So what is the floor area, how many bedrooms does it have, how many units does it have, etc. For those of you that are dying for more information, you can always scroll to the bottom and see what the key assumptions are for the base case. And over here, you'll start to see some of the data that IFC has collected. And if you really want to, you can also change it for a specific reason. But we won't go there. Instead, I'll start showing you the 3 key tabs. So if we start in the Energy tab, the beauty of Edge is that it essentially gives you this model on the right-hand side, which again is saving a lot of time and making it a lot easier for anybody, whether you have training or not, to understand what the efficiency profile is of your building. But it also gives you literally a list of things that you could implement in your building to make it more efficient. So it not only shows you what your profile is, but also gives you your roadmap of how to make it a resource efficient building. And here's the best part. It also gives you some estimated data at the top in terms of the incremental cost, your return on investment, your utility cost reductions, what your estimated final water and energy use is, as well as your carbon emission savings, your water savings and your energy savings. So again, when we think about why this tool is so revolutionary and why this can truly help to make every building green, it's because it's democratizing this access to data. This data that could have been really difficult, very time consuming, and in many cases very costly to implement is suddenly at everybody's fingertips for every country around the world. And it really is catered to each unique environment. So if I had a design and I had selected Greece, where I'm currently located, the data would be different because inherently the costs and the savings and the climatic conditions and the building regulations in Greece are different than the UK. And that is being updated on a yearly basis. So it really is showing the changes in regulations. So let's take a quick look at how this could be really useful. So I've put in some basic measures in here. So I've put in some insulation. I've put in some insulation for my external walls. You start to see that this building now, which is my right-hand building, has 16.9% higher energy efficiency than a standard building that would be built for low middle income housing in London. Now, if I said I wanted to implement energy saving light bulbs in internal spaces and I select this measure, all of a sudden, you see that dynamic change of my graph, and you also see that I'm now at 25% energy savings compared to my local baseline, and you also see that I've now met my EDGE standard. So that was quite easy again because I've plugged in some information beforehand, but you can start to see how you can improve your building, and again, you can look at the top and see, I don't know if you noticed this, but before my payback was in about 6.68 years, it's now gone down to 5.5 years, and I can see my incremental cost per unit. Now the same is true for the water and materials tab. So in my water tab, I have selected some low flow shower heads and low flow faucets. If, for example, I decided to implement dual flush water closets in my bathrooms, and you can select specific data, but for now, let's just leave it as it is, you can see immediately again the change. And as with the energy tab, everything is color coded, so you can start to drill down and understand where your biggest impacts are. In this case, we've met the EDGE standard, reaching the 23% savings, so we can move on if we wanted to stay within this EDGE certified standard. Again, the beauty of it is you can see your payback, you can see your incremental cost, and so you can start to see how far can you push that number? What level of energy efficiency can you provide to your building, your client's building, at what cost, and how can you help make these buildings as green as possible? If we finally move to the Materials tab, here you'll see a slightly different interface, but essentially the building is broken out into the different components, and you can see there are drop-down menus of different materials. And underneath this is the database of the embodied energy within each material. And there's user guidance. So if there are specific materials that you're using that aren't found in here, there's a material user guide where you can find materials that are very similar or might be named something different across different countries to be able to select the appropriate one. So in this case, we are already meeting the EDGE standard. We have some concrete slabs with some hollow concrete internal walls, nylon and UPVC and polyurethane. You can start to change these and see how they would affect your building. So in this case, we're quite close to the standard. But if, for example, you decided to go for plasterboard with timber studs, just to see what the difference was, that actually did not help us. So you can start to assess what and how different materials improve or worsen your impact. Now, for existing buildings, because you already have the materials and you're reusing them, you pretty much automatically get this section covered, and you would then look to, if you had any major construction changes, input that information. But for existing buildings, this section is not as important as the other two sections. And again, for existing buildings, the base case that's being calculated is based on current building regulations, which does make it challenging in terms of the refurbishment efforts. But again, if we take a step back and think of the bigger picture, that's a good thing as we push towards greener buildings and stronger and more stringent regulations and higher quality, particularly for those of us based in Europe, where most of the building stock between now and 2050 already exists. So if we are to meet the net zero by 2050, we need to look at major refurbishments and really pushing what is possible with what we have. Now, I'm going to stop here in terms of the EDGE app, and I can remind you, you can find the EDGE app on the edgebuildings.com website at the top right-hand corner. And again, you don't need to create an account. So if you want to play around, you can absolutely log on at any time and get a sense of how it works and how it might be applicable for yourself, for your clients, and for anyone in between. A couple more notes from me, and then I will open up to questions. I see the chat and the Q&A are bouncing with comments, so I look forward to reading them momentarily. But if we come back to our original question of, can every building be green? I think the answer is a resounding yes. And EDGE really has proven that that's possible. When you look at some examples of EDGE certified projects around the world, and I struggled very much to only put 6 on this page, but I didn't want to inundate you with lots of information, you really see the variety of projects, from corporate offices to little supermarkets to warehouses to affordable housing in Haiti to COVID hospitals in Ghana to universities in Cambodia. We have airports, we have shipping terminals, we have high-income housing, we have large social housing developments with thousands of units, we have a cinema, we have stadiums, hotels, resorts, light industry factories. This is truly what a green building revolution looks like, and what it actually looks like to green every building on this planet. And because it's quantitative, because we have this democratization of data, we have an opportunity to change the narrative and take away this idea that green buildings are a luxury good, and instead make it a practice that can be implemented on every single building. Now, not every single building is going to be a certified green building, but I guarantee you that through using EDGE, every building can be at least resource efficient, can be either designed from scratch to incorporate as many efficiency measures as possible at a logical incremental cost. And for existing buildings, all these buildings can be improved, and this tool can be used to help transition the building stock that we have and the building stock that is yet to be developed to be green and ultimately net zero. So I really hope you're going to join me and help make this vision a reality, because we can make every building on this planet green. It's up to us to make that a reality. I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions. But first of all, thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope I didn't speak too quickly. I tried not to caffeinate too much. Let me open up the chat now and the questions. We have lots of time. We've got about 20 minutes, so there's plenty of time for a good conversation. So I'm going to start with the chat and then I will move into the Q&A. So the first question is that having the current standards for existing buildings should be encouraged, but it shouldn't be a barrier to make improvements. So I think that's absolutely true and a fair point. And it comes to this original statement of not every building will be certified. I think currently maybe we're at less than 1% penetration of green certified buildings globally. And there are different cases and reasons as to why buildings should be certified. But the idea of the EDGE application is at least every building and every person has the data available to make those improvements, whether they meet the baseline for EDGE or not. And I think there's a growing awareness that particularly for retrofit and refurbishment, the challenge is enormous. I'm thinking of the UK in particular. We have massive amounts of building stock. We have old buildings. We have areas of conservation and massive challenges to actually be able to implement some of the government's goals because it's expensive and it's challenging and requires a whole new workforce. So I think there's definitely an understanding that we shouldn't create barriers for homes, particularly to make improvements. But I do think we need to set the standard high in terms of those that go for certification, because if we're truly rewarding buildings that are making these efforts to be green and who are looking for those additional benefits, we should be making sure that the efforts are truly happening and are truly making a positive impact on the environment. And if they are making an improvement that's, say, 10% better than the regulation that existed 30 years ago, then is it truly making a difference? I think it's a tough question that we do need to ask ourselves. Second question we have is, how do you find what products are listed within the EDGE application? So EDGE doesn't have its own, it doesn't list products, it only lists material types. We're hoping someday to be able to integrate EPDs within the material section, so you could input EPD information directly. But right now it is based on the database that IFC has developed in the background. So it is product agnostic. Question number 3, and then I will open the Q&A. I'm sorry, there's information from multiple sources. So to some of the outputs from EDGE link with BREEAM, is there any synergy, and how do you sit EDGE sitting alongside other rating systems? So currently there isn't an intersection between EDGE and BREEAM. The EDGE team from IFC have been working with different standards, and particularly on the sustainability side as well. So there's integration with GRESB, there's integration with CDP, with climate body initiatives, etc. Less so on the green building standards, although in China there's integration with 3-star, and I think they were looking at some kind of overlap with DGNB as well. But as far as I know, BREEAM has not, we don't have an overlap with BREEAM. But in general, the synergy and kind of where EDGE sits across other rating systems is that EDGE is something that can truly scale. So I think every green building standard does add value into the larger ecosystem. What makes EDGE different is its scalability and the idea that you're not implementing EDGE on your one flagship building, but you're implementing EDGE on every single one of your buildings within your portfolio. So we have some clients that are using EDGE across thousands of buildings across multiple countries. And that's possible for maybe one of the first times ever in the green building sector because of the way it's designed, because of the way it's scalable, and because it's global in nature. I think EDGE is the first green building standard that was truly designed to be global from the beginning, as opposed to being designed within one country context and then applied globally. And particularly because it has this local database and takes into account the local conditions, it really can be applied. So you can have your EDGE standard in Europe, which is actually really hard to achieve in Europe because they're really high local regulations. So getting 20%, 40% higher than your local regulation in the UK is truly challenging, but can also be applied to other regions of the world that perhaps don't have as stringent local building codes and can be used as a tool to improve performance. Question around the coronavirus pandemic impacting the expansion of urbanization as more people are working from home, and the shrinking of office spaces. So we're definitely seeing the office sector have quite an impact from the pandemic, but I think particularly in different regions of the world, it's starting to come back. So I think looking ahead, we haven't seen the full impact of COVID on real estate. There's definitely changes to be made, but I think what we are seeing is more and more emphasis on green as part of the recovery, from government focuses globally, from investors as well. So I think there's a lot still to be seen moving ahead. Question about how to obtain Edge software. So if you just go to the edgebuildings.com website, you can just access the Edge application online. It's just a web platform from the link that I showed. Is Edge available and suitable for local authority housing asset managers? Edge is suitable for everybody and is currently being used in a variety of different ways. So we've seen Edge today a little bit more from the developer, owner, occupier side of things, but Edge is also being used by financiers, so by the investor community, to actually assess eligibility for green loans, for green mortgages, for green bonds. And so there are teams within large investors that are just using this to do the assessments, to do part of their due diligence process. It's also being used by governments. So IFC has worked with national and local governments around the world to help integrate Edge as a planning tool, and also as part of a local building regulation. So there are definitely different ways that Edge can make sense for local authorities and for housing asset managers. I'm happy to discuss that in more detail offline, but please feel free to contact me and we can have that conversation in a little bit more detail. A couple more questions around Edge versus BREEAM versus LEED. So I would say similar discussion around what I said with BREEAM. I think everything has value, and we're seeing some really incredible achievements around the world across all the different building standards. I would just say that Edge's unique factor is, again, its global scale and its ability to be implemented and make this vision of every building being green a reality. Why would a company that's already implemented a different certification scheme decide to move to Edge? So I think it's partly the scale. We have seen some cases where companies are actually certifying with multiple standards for additional credibility. We've also seen situations where a building might meet one standard and fail in Edge because of the way that things are structured. So it really depends on the project. I think in terms of a sustainability strategy, moving to Edge is advantageous for companies because of the quantification. So it can help to directly link into sustainability targets. So if you have a specific fixed emissions reduction target, you can quantify your carbon savings directly from the Edge application, which makes your sustainability team's life a lot easier. And I say this from experience, having worked in a sustainability consultancy. And then again, because you can implement Edge at scale. So in some cases, there are definitely people that have implemented BREEAM or LEED across portfolios. They're quite rare, whereas Edge could be applied to an entire portfolio of a company's assets, which again could strengthen a sustainability commitment and as well could put them on the path for net zero carbon. And you can start using the quantifiable element of Edge to start saying, 20% of your portfolio is 40% more energy efficient, with 10% being zero carbon, and start driving the sustainability strategy forward from there. Are the building regulations relevant to the area where the building is located? So, for example, differences in energy requirements between Scottish and English regulations. Absolutely. So there are different cities listed within the Edge application within each country. Some countries will have more cities listed than others, and that tends to be a sort of one-to-one where tends to be more projects. But the building regulations are at a national and local level where applicable. And IFC does update at minimum once a year and more frequently with smaller updates the regulations, because they do change quite a lot, and they did release a big version update in December, and it's currently being in beta and will be rolled out officially in March, which added all of the rest of the world. So that was North America, Australia, and Japan were missing from the broader database, and updated the EU regulations. But yes, it does take into account the difference between local and national. For comparison studies, do only certified buildings go into those, just to make sure there's verified data? Yes. So anybody can use the EDGE application, but when we're talking about EDGE certified buildings, or we're talking about data from EDGE, it is only the certified buildings that are being used for comparison, because anyone could put anything in the EDGE application. As you saw, I clicked lots of buttons, which doesn't necessarily mean that my building has all of those measures. So buildings do have to go through the certification stage to be able to count in the data. Question on what is involved in the certification of a project, sorry. So to certify a project, essentially the client, so whether that is the company that owns the building or a consultant that's working with a company, fills out the EDGE application to assess their own building. So it's a self-assessment approach, and you can put in all the information. You'll be able to get access to some training in terms of how to use EDGE with your auditor. So Centali works with SGS, as I mentioned, and SGS would do a kickoff meeting with you to just let you know how the EDGE app works, what you should be looking for. You would go through the self-assessment process, build out your building, reach your efficiency savings, upload documentation to prove that everything that you say is true, and then you submit that for audit. If it's a new building or a building that's going for preliminary certification, because there's two stages, there's preliminary certification for the design of the building, and then there's post-construction certification once the building has been built. For existing buildings going straight for the refurbishment, you can sometimes skip preliminary certification and go straight for the end unless there's a big reconstruction happening. So if you're going for a new building and you have the preliminary certification phase, your auditor reviews all the documentation for the design. That goes through to the certifier, and if it's approved, you get issued a preliminary certificate. And the preliminary certificate can be used to take to financiers. You can market that you have a preliminary certificate. You can use it to drive sales for your project. And then once the building is built, an auditor from SGS comes and visits on site. Under COVID restrictions, we also have remote site auditing options, and checks again that everything has been built as designed, and then that comes again to the certifier, and then assuming all is well, that goes through to certification, and you get your final certificate. Question about what's required to become an EDGE expert consultant. So to become an EDGE expert consultant, you have to take an 8-hour EDGE expert training. If you go to the Centali.com website, there's a section on training, and you can see a little bit more detail about what that involves. But it essentially is a deep dive into EDGE, into the methodology, the calculations, etc. Once you've done the training, you then have to take an EDGE exam that is run through Prometric. And once you pass that exam, you get IFC accredited as an EDGE expert, and then you can use that accreditation. Question around EDGE being free. Okay, so since EDGE is free, where's the financial factor for the whole concept? And who selects the EDGE experts and appoints them? So indeed, the EDGE application is free, and that is really, again, to hammer this point of being able to green every building, because not everything will be certified. The buildings that go through certification is where the finance bit comes in. So there is a fee for certification and auditing. In terms of the EDGE experts, so there's an IFC list of EDGE experts around the world on their website, and we at Centali SGS also have our own network of consultants that we recommend to our clients. And the details of that probably we'll discuss offline, but in general, it really depends on the project in terms of the type of work and the type of contracting. But it can range from supporting through the EDGE process and helping through the certification scheme, all the way through to advising on specific measures and where to find them and how to green the building. So it's quite a broad range on the consultancy side, but definitely very interesting and happy to discuss in more detail offline. Are all the green building certificates the same, or do they differ in value? So the two, the EDGE certified and EDGE advanced certificates are asset level. They are evergreen, so you don't have to renew them, and they have the same value. So it's just a matter of how many savings, what percentage of savings you can get before receiving the certificate. The zero carbon one is a renewable certificate, so you have to renew it every 2 to 4 years, and that has a lower cost because for that it's simply we're looking at a project that has already received an EDGE advanced certificate and is simply looking to cover the operational energy. Are there any plans for EDGE to become available as a mobile app so that it can be input where there's no internet? That's a great question. I will pass that on to IFC actually, because I'm not sure, but I think that's a really, really good idea. So I will certainly pass that on to IFC. Could EDGE become the #1 certification scheme around the world and replace some of the current existing systems? That is a very good question, and potentially. I think it's growing at a pace, at an exponential pace, and it's growing truly around the world. So I think, so America, the US was just added in January, and we've already got a couple of projects that want to be added there. So once we do that, we should have projects on every continent, which is quite exciting. But definitely the simplicity and the data element of it give it a good foundation to really grow and become a certification scheme of choice. We have, there's a sub-question asking if there's been a comparison between EDGE advanced buildings and BREEAM excellent, very good. There have been some comparisons, and as I mentioned, because of the way that different building certification schemes are structured, sometimes it might meet EDGE and not meet BREEAM, or it might meet BREEAM and not meet EDGE, or it might meet one of them and not meet the other one. So it is really interesting, and I think it comes down to my original point around the definition of a green building and kind of quantifying that perspective. But in general, I think, again, I'm just going to come back to this. The value of EDGE is that you know exactly what that number is, and you know what that quantified element is, and that is much more powerful in any kind of communication, because whether you talk to your employees, whether you talk to your investors, whether you talk to your customers, you can say, I am X% more efficient, which can be much more powerful than a qualitative descriptive word, which can be hard to explain because it encompasses so many different things. Question, is it the consultant's role to assess the technicality of the project around ventilation, PV panels, etc.? So that really depends on the actual project and the project team that's working on it in the background. So in some cases, the consultant will play a bigger role, and in other cases, we have many clients that choose not to use consultants, and that actually works quite well for EDGE because it's so streamlined and straightforward. It wasn't designed with the idea that you need to hire somebody to do this for you. You can do it by yourself. And I'll caveat with myself and say I am not an engineer in training, and I can use EDGE. Now, granted, if I was doing the self-assessment, I would need a little bit of help, but it's definitely not the level of complexity as you've seen with other areas within the green building market that require years and years of training to be able to even start looking at the assessment. So the consultant's role really depends on the project and really depends on the client and what level of involvement they want within the process. Are there any scenarios in terms of deviations in the savings at the certification stage of the building versus what was arrived in the EDGE application? So that's a really good question, and it's a question we get a lot in terms of, well, how accurate is the data within EDGE? And I believe the current state is that it's at a 98% accuracy in terms of savings, but IFC always asks the certified projects to provide operational data after everything has been certified after several years to just check, because this is a huge issue within the building market where something is designed to do something, and then when you actually put humans in it, the performance is completely different. And so this performance gap is something that's definitely still being seen across the board and with Edge and beyond. So it's pretty accurate, but it's always a little bit of room for error. I would say the particular area where there might be differences is the incremental cost data. So we always say use the incremental cost data to guide your decisions, but still do calculations and check in your particular market and get the actual cost data, because of course it's impossible to be 100% accurate within this application for all the cost data around the world, and every supplier will have different costs. What are the cost implications for Edge certification? So, sorry, there's lots of questions. If I don't get to your questions, I will certainly email you. I know it's almost time. So if anybody needs to hop off, thank you very much for joining me. I'll stay on and answer a few more questions. The cost implications of Edge certification. So the costing there's different elements to it. So there's the registration of the project, there's a certification of the project, and then there's the audit of the project. So Cintali SGS has standard pricing and non-standard pricing. What our standard pricing is covers a residential development of up to 3 types of typologies and 150 units, or on the commercial side, a single building with a single use, so a warehouse, a school, a hospital. Our standard pricing, so regardless of the location, no matter where it is in the world, and no matter how large or small it is $10,700. And that includes everything. So the registration, the certification, the design audit, and the site audit. And again, as a reminder, you don't need to hire a consultant to do the Edge certification. So if the company, for example, chose to do the certification themselves, that would be it. That would be the entire cost. For anything that doesn't fit into that description, we do pricing based on understanding the complexity of the project, so the different types of typologies, construction phases, etc. We also do portfolio projects, so really implementing Edge at scale for hundreds or thousands of buildings. And in that case, we really find efficiencies of scale through process development, through finding replicability, through working with the same team and finding efficiencies and savings, and really apply those to the cost. So it really is cost effective and resource effective. Is it beneficial for an engineer to become an Edge expert, and how much does it cost to become an Edge auditor? So all of our auditors are through SGS, so we do not work with external auditors, only through SGS. But in terms of becoming an Edge expert, that's how we work with external consultants, and we try to integrate them within the package. And it's absolutely beneficial for an engineer to be an Edge expert, or architects. We've seen quite a variety of different backgrounds to become Edge experts. If everybody can make buildings green using the free software, what is the role of a consultant in the whole process? So the idea is that everybody can make buildings more green, but unfortunately that doesn't always happen. And so there's always a need for consultants, both in terms of being able to do the work when it needs to be outsourced. So there are many companies or organizations that just don't have the internal capacity to do this work, whether they could do it by themselves or not. And then of course there's a role in terms of the advisory. So there's, people get stuck. You might be able to see all of the options, but actually finding the technology to implement it, finding the good suppliers, figuring out how to do it, there's definitely a big role for Edge experts. And there's a role in terms of training clients and working alongside the process and supporting. So again, it varies so much depending on the project, but it's quite a diverse role. What is the difference between edgebuildings.com and edge.gbci.org? So edge.gbci.org is one of the global certification providers. Cintali SGS is one of the other global certification providers. Edgebuildings.com is the IFC website, and that should be your go-to for all things Edge. Does Edge plan to have recertification of buildings after a specific operational time? So the Edge Certified and Edge Advanced do not have recertification because the certificate is based on how the building was built. Edge Zero Carbon, because it's depending on how the building operates, does have recertification every 2 to 4 years. I think I have answered every question, but if you have any more questions, please do feel free to reach out. My email is on the screen. I'd be very happy to hear from you. Thank you so very much for taking the time to join me today and to learn a little bit about Edge and the broader vision of how we can make every building green. I hope you're excited and energized by the process, and I hope that we are able to work together to really make this vision a reality. Again, if you have any questions or if you'd like to discuss further, please do reach out to me. My virtual door is open. You will get a copy of the recording and of the slides within the next couple of days via email. So keep an eye out for that so you can always watch back and get additional information that way. Thank you again very much, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.